Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's source material because, well, we are embarking on a journey to explore literally the most complex, intricate, and mysterious structure in the known universe. Yep, I'm talking about the human mind. If you love understanding how things work, and especially how you work, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to break down the foundational concepts of psychology using a super-structured approach so you can easily lock these insights in.
I mean, it's the ultimate human mystery, isn't it? Why do we act the way we do? Why do we feel, perceive, and think the way we do? From the activities of tiny individual neurons firing in your brain all the way up to the complex behaviors of entire societies, psychology seeks to answer this exact fundamental question. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. Decoding the human mind. 2. Evolution of psychological thought. 3. Giants who shaped psychology. 4. Modern fields of study. And finally, 5. Psychology in everyday life. Let's jump right into Section 1, Decoding the Human Mind. What actually is psychology?
So, psychology is officially defined as the scientific study of two very specific things: behavior and mental processes. Notice the distinction here because it's a big one. Behavior refers to the physical actions we can actually observe and measure. If someone is running, shouting, or, let's be honest, doom scrolling on their phone, that's observable behavior. But mental processes, our thoughts, our emotions, our underlying motivations, those can't be directly seen. They have to be inferred by looking at that observable behavior. Basically, psychologists use the scientific method to bridge the gap between what we see on the outside and what is happening on the inside.
To pull this off effectively, psychologists operate on 4 primary goals. Think of it like a workflow. First, they describe the behavior to identify the patterns. Then, they explain it by digging for the underlying causes. Once they understand the cause, they can predict future actions based on those patterns. And finally, they control or modify behavior. Now that sounds a bit sci-fi, but it simply means developing helpful interventions to promote positive outcomes, like helping someone overcome a debilitating phobia. If you keep this workflow in mind, the entire field makes perfect sense.
Moving on to Section 2, Evolution of Psychological Thought, from Philosophy to Science.
You know, psychology wasn't always a hard science with laboratories and brain scanners. It has this incredibly rich history that evolved over centuries. Thousands of years ago, ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle were already asking deep questions about memory, perception, and the soul. In the medieval period, you had scholars like Avicenna discussing actual treatments for psychological disorders in texts like the Book of Healing. But the major turning point, the real paradigm shift, hits the timeline in 1879, when Wilhelm Wundt established the very first psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. That marked the exact moment psychology stepped out of philosophy and into the realm of science. And this paved the way for the dominant theories of the early 20th century, and eventually, the cognitive revolution and modern neuroscience, where we use tools like fMRI scans to literally watch the brain function in real time.
Now, in those early days of scientific psychology, a massive debate emerged, and this brilliantly illustrates how two brilliant minds can look at the exact same thing and ask completely different questions. On one hand, we have Wundt's structuralism. He wanted to break the mind down into its most basic components through a process called introspection. Think of it like architecture, right? He was looking for the structure, the basic bricks and mortar of the mind. In total contrast, American psychologist William James introduced functionalism. Instead of asking what the mind is made of, James acted more like an engineer asking, what does this machine actually do? How does our stream of consciousness help us adapt and survive in our environment? Functionalism shifted the whole focus to practical, real-world applications of human behavior. All right, Section 3, Giants who shaped psychology, the pioneers of the mind.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer contrast between the ideas of these pioneers. We have Sigmund Freud diving into the dark depths of the unconscious, Carl Jung expanding that into universal myths, B.F. Skinner completely ignoring the mind to look only at observable actions, and Carl Rogers taking a deeply optimistic view of human potential. Let's break each of these giants down one by one.
First up is the Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud. You've definitely heard of him. Freud introduced psychoanalysis, proposing the pretty radical idea that much of our behavior is driven by an unconscious mind filled with hidden desires and conflicts. He basically divided the mind into 3 warring factions that act a lot like terrible roommates. You've got the id, which is our primal, I want it right now instinctual drive. Then the superego, which acts as our incredibly strict moral compass. And finally, the ego, the stressed out mediator trapped in the middle, just trying to balance our base instincts with reality. When the conflict gets too intense, Freud argued that our ego uses defense mechanisms, things like repression or denial, to protect us from psychological distress.
Let's move along and see how this builds with our next pioneer, Carl Jung. Jung was initially a close collaborator of Freud, but he eventually diverged to form analytical psychology. He felt Freud was a bit too hyper-focused on personal conflicts. Instead, Jung proposed something totally mind-bending, the collective unconscious. He believed that beneath our personal memories lies a deeper layer shared by literally all human beings across time and culture. This collective unconscious is populated by archetypes. These are universal symbols like the hero or the shadow that manifest in our dreams, our myths, and our cultural narratives. For Jung, psychological health meant integrating all these different aspects of the self into a unified whole.
Radically shifting gears here, we arrive at the American psychologist B.F. Skinner, who was a massive champion of behaviorism. Skinner thought diving into the unconscious was, well, unscientific. Instead, he argued we should solely study what we can measure, observable behavior. He developed the theory of operant conditioning, which is the idea that behavior is strictly shaped by its consequences. If an action is followed by a reward, positive reinforcement, you'll do it again. If it's punished, you'll stop. And get this, our modern world relies heavily on his discoveries. For example, Skinner found that a variable ratio schedule, meaning a reward is given after an unpredictable number of actions, produces incredibly high rates of behavior. So if you've ever found yourself mindlessly pulling down on your smartphone to refresh your feed, hunting for that unpredictable reward of a new notification, yeah, you are experiencing Skinner's variable ratio conditioning firsthand.
Finally, we have Carl Rogers, who really pushed back against both the dark determinism of Freud and the robotic conditioning of Skinner. Rogers founded Humanistic psychology. He looked at humans and saw an inherent positive drive toward growth and self-actualization. Rogers built his theory around a really powerful concept, unconditional positive regard. He believed that for people to truly grow and heal, they need an environment of total acceptance and empathy, entirely free from judgment. He argued that when our self-concept, the way we see ourselves, aligns with our actual experiences, we achieve genuine psychological well-being.
Section 4. Modern Fields of Study. The Specialized Branches of Psychology.
When most people picture a psychologist, they usually picture clinical psychology, professionals assessing and treating mental health disorders using tools like cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. But happening concurrently is cognitive psychology. Remember that cognitive revolution we saw on our timeline earlier? Well, these psychologists are studying the actual machinery of human thought, how we process information, solve problems, and retain memory. And their research doesn't just stay in a lab. It actively informs things like artificial intelligence and user interface design to ensure the software you use perfectly aligns with how your brain naturally processes information.
Then you have developmental psychology, which takes the long view. It maps our physical and cognitive changes literally from the cradle to the grave, answering deep questions about language acquisition and identity formation. Social psychology, on the other hand, zooms out entirely to look at the environment. Social psychologists investigate how our behavior is influenced by the presence of others. They study vital societal dynamics like conformity, persuasion, and the roots of prejudice, helping us understand how the simple presence of a crowd can completely alter a person's moral compass and decision-making.
And let's not forget where many of us spend the majority of our waking hours, the workplace. Industrial organizational, or IO psychology, takes all these profound psychological principles and applies them directly to organizations. These experts work to optimize hiring, evaluate leadership styles, and most importantly, improve employee motivation and well-being. They're essentially the scientists trying to build healthier, more productive corporate cultures.
Bringing us to Section 5, Psychology in Everyday Life. Why this matters to you.
So, the crucial point is that all of this theory isn't just trapped in some dusty textbook, it is embedded everywhere in your life. In mental health, evidence-based practices like mindfulness and cognitive behavioral interventions are actively saving lives and treating complex disorders every single day. In education, research from cognitive psychologists has given us tools like spaced repetition and active learning, vastly improving how students retain information compared to just passively reading. Over in the workplace, IO psychology is the driving force pushing for better work-life balance and effective leadership. And in your own personal decision-making, just understanding your own cognitive biases can help you step back, assess the situation neutrally, and make fundamentally better choices. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, haven't we? From the observable behavior Skinner studied to the deep, collective, unconscious Jung proposed, we've seen exactly how this science describes, explains, predicts, and helps control behavior for the better. So now that you have a map of the hidden mechanics of your own mind, how will that understanding change the choices you make tomorrow? Seriously, think about it the next time you reach for your phone for a quick dopamine hit, or when you notice a defense mechanism kicking in during an argument. Because ultimately, the power of psychology is the power of self-awareness. Thank you so much for exploring this material with me today, and as always, keep learning.